Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, a comprehensive look at accommodations, how to start the conversation. Today's webinar is brought to you by COABE. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Stephanie Rittberger, who's going to moderate today, and she'll introduce our presenters. Stephanie?
Hi, I'm Steph Rittberger, Region 5 Rep for COABE, and I want to introduce Kevin Baas, who is the HR Director over at Holiday Inn in Rapid City, South Dakota, and he has a lot of experience in hospitality and retail. And so I think it's really important that we have our voice of business and industry today, as well as the Executive Director of the Workforce Diversity Network of the Black Hills, Catherine Greseth. And I'm really excited to be able to moderate because Catherine really helped me realize that I needed to change orientation and enrollment processes to start talking about accommodations and disabilities with people much earlier. And we needed to look at helping students advocate for themselves, understand the process, and then really navigate that world of work. So with that being said, this is a great segue into the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Symposium. So I just want to make sure everybody remembers to sign up for June 8th. It's going to be a great day of training. And this is kind of a great preview for some of those topics. And I just want to make sure everybody remembers to register. It's free and Google is sponsoring that. So with that being said, I'm going to let Katie take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Catherine Greseth. I am the Executive Director of the Workforce Diversity Network here in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And my main focus with my position is educating businesses on hiring and retaining people that are become disabled. I myself, when I was 44, woke up on a Sunday morning and I had lost my eyesight due to some injuries that had happened 20 years prior. My retinas came off with Baas. I stayed employed. I was working for a large corporation at that time, calling on doctors and setting up patients with WinCare, which is home respiratory. I was later recruited about 8 years later to a company in New Mexico that had hospice and long-term care and doing the same thing, educating doctors. And I developed some scar tissue in my eyes and went into the doctor, and I was not going to be able to drive any longer due to the scar tissue that had developed. So I took a note in to this company and they set me in a corner for the day. And then they let me go. They terminated me, saying due to my eyesight, I was terminated. So at that point I said, wow, somebody needs to go educate businesses. And I want to help you as educators be able to help your students advocate, because I'm sure some of the students you have maybe have had a disability, because most disabilities come from an illness or an accident. And in our lifetime, we're all going to be told at some point that we can no longer do the things we used to do, because just with age comes disability. So we'll look at some of the things that are considered a disability according to the ADA. We'll also look at what reasonable accommodations are. Kevin's going to talk to you about how to help your students advocate for themselves when they're talking to HR directors or managers. So one of the things I often get from businesses is, how will I be able to know if a person can do the job? And I always say, have them show you, how they're going to do something. They have to tell that to every applicant that applies. But they can actually ask you to show me how you would do that. And I'll give you some examples. We've got some pretty amazing stories out here in the Black Hills. What is an accommodation? Any changes in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. So you can go to the next slide, Stephanie. So those accommodations can be anything from looking at the essential function of the job. Sometimes what I see for every applicant, it'll say you need to hear, see, and drive. Well, if you are the receptionist, do you really need to be able to hear, see, and drive? Do you need to drive? You need to be to work on time, definitely, but you probably don't need to drive. So one of the things I would tell you to tell your students, make sure they look at those essential functions of the job. See if there's things that can be changed. And Kevin's going to go into that in further
You were
detail
screen sharing.
down the road a little bit and talk about some of those things and what he's done for different people that have applied for jobs that maybe couldn't do all of maybe all of what
The
we've
basic
done.
PowerPoint. Okay.
That's some technical difficulties. we have.
You ready, Sharon?
Is anybody seeing us out there? Are you able to see the slides? I'm seeing them and I'm just double checking.
I can see him on my end.
Okay, perfect. Yep, and I can see other people are seeing them, so that's perfect. I just wanted to make sure because I had somebody stop in and let me know. Okay, perfect. I'm going to mute myself and let it keep going.
All right.
So, okay, so again, the accommodations can be anything from maybe looking at changing the job a little bit, giving some duties to a different person or department. For example, with me, I was calling on doctors. All I needed, and I had my own accommodation, my husband was going to drive for me. So maybe it's having somebody else that can do that job. That's not even going to cost the company any money. Or it can also be changing positions. I was out calling on doctors. Maybe I could go to the inside department of marketing because I had a large background in marketing. So it can be a lot of different things that can be just switched around as long as it's not a big hardship to the company. And Kevin, again, will go into some of those details of what's considered a hardship. I'm also the ADA ambassador for the Rocky Mountain region. And I wanted to just make sure that everybody understood the equal employment opportunities with the ADA. And it's to attain the same level of performance or enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment that anyone else can. So being able to make that job so it's enjoyable so that the person's able to do it is a big part of that. Again, anything can happen to anybody. Many times I'll have employers say, well, I'm not going to hire somebody with disabilities. And I might already have someone, they just haven't revealed their disability yet. And we're coming into the inclusion, which it's much easier now to reveal a disability and to talk about that disability and be a part of that process when you are getting hired on or once you've been accepted the job.
Hey,
So,
Catherine, I don't think the slides are advancing properly.
yeah, that's what we thought. Can you just
She's sharing her screen.
So maybe Stephanie can give it to Kevin and we'll share from our side.
I think certainly I'm going to stop sharing. All right, Kevin should be able to take it, I believe.
Okay, this is, I just have to open the presentation. Is at the bottom. Oh, not that button. Okay. Stephanie, I don't see where to control the PowerPoint.
Stephanie, I think if you put it in presentation mode and try resharing it in that, you can advance the slides.
We apologize for any technical difficulties.
So people click on the ones on. Well, that's my screen. It's not what they see.
We can go on without the PowerPoint.
I don't have your slides, so.
Do you want me just to go on, Stephanie?
We should be on, we can hear us.
Yeah, go ahead and go on, and I'm gonna see if I can't get this, so I'll catch up if I can.
Okay. So we can, some of the things that can be done that a student can look for when they're, after they've been offered a job, or even during the interview process, is making modifications to increase facility accessibility, flexible scheduling. So maybe you can only work so many hours, or maybe you need to take different breaks during the day because you need to be able to take insulin for your diabetes. So there's different things that can be done there. Acquiring new equipment. For me, I have Zoom text and text to speak. So, and that equipment I already have. So many times that's something you already have. So you can just bring it to your employer. It's not going to cost the employer any extra amount of money, which is sometimes can be a big concern, especially if it's a small business. It's not a large corporation. And providing interpreters, especially at the interview, that might be necessary at the beginning, and then from there you can figure out how you're going to communicate. And there's a lot of different things. I don't know if everybody knows, but texting actually came from the deaf community. Siri came from the blind community. So a lot of the innovations came from the disability world that has made it amazing for all of us. And you might have to change to another department. Like I said, if I couldn't be out doing the marketing as far as calling on doctors, maybe I went to the inside marketing department, or maybe I go to a completely different department within the business that I'm qualified to do. Some of the things that aren't reasonable accommodations are eliminating the essential functions of the job. But again, we need to look at what are those essential functions of the job. I'll give you a great story that I have. It's a pallet. They build pallets here in Rapid City, and their HR director interviewed a gentleman, and he was an amputee. His right arm was amputated. And after the interview, the whole company heard that their HR director had hired this gentleman, and they're like, how is he going to do the job? He can't even lift. He only has one arm. And he said he can do it. Just give him a chance. So the next day he came in, and he invented a pulley system. So that lifted the pallets by a pulley. So people didn't have to lift like they were before, and it made it amazing for all of the employees. So it's just one of the stories out there of people with disabilities and what somebody came up with to make it amazing for everybody else. And of course, like I said, the staff was a little concerned of how they were going to do this, but the HR director had it. And I'm sure he probably talked to her about what he was going to do and how he would be able to do it. If it's going to lower the production, or it's going to affect the other employees. So if that was going to hold up production from the other employees being able to do their job correctly, or if it was going to put other employees in danger, that would be a problem. Then it's not reasonable. And providing personal use items, that means like if somebody needed to have a prosthetic because they had to stand, that wouldn't be considered a reasonable accommodation. Or if they needed to have a wheelchair and they wanted the company to supply it, that wouldn't be a reasonable accommodation because that would be part of what they needed for everyday living. And if it's an undue hardship, again, a lot of times that goes into the cost, but things aren't as expensive as they used to be. A lot of that was with all of our technology. Back when technology first came out, it was very, very expensive. So now it's pretty much mainstream and anything can be acquired. And at the end of the webinar, I'll tell you some places that you can go to look for accommodations, or where your students can look so that they know where they can find some accommodations if they need it. What is a disability? Some people will say, oh, I have a disability, but do they have a disability? Well, according to the ADA, you have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, or if you have a history of such a disability. So let's say I had a heart attack and that limits me from doing a few things, but I recovered from that heart attack. So I don't necessarily have to deal with some of the symptoms I had right after I had the heart attack, but I have a history of having had that type of a disability. So, or maybe it's cancer, which cancer is considered a disability. So Maybe I've recovered from cancer, I'm good, but I have a history of that. So there could be problems that come up in the future. So that's an important thing to know. So having a history of that. Activities included but not limited to seeing, hearing, caring for oneself, doing everyday tasks, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, all of those things. So those are daily things that we deal with each day. And breathing, that can even be anything from COPD to asthma, and maybe it's asthma that's onset by activity. Things that we call invisible disabilities that you don't see. So the average person is going to see those things when they look at you. They're going to think you're just fine. We call those invisible disabilities, along with some mental illness, some other things that they're not right there. It's not like when somebody uses a wheelchair and we see that, we know they have a disability. So that interactive process starts with disclosure. So because of my medical condition or disability, I'm having trouble with my job duties. So they would say, this is what I can do, and this is where I'm struggling a little bit, and this is how I could probably do my job better. So it's kind of knowing what the solutions are when you go to take that interview, or once you have had that job offer. And again, Kevin's going to go into some of those details a little further from his perspective. So when to tell. If if your disability doesn't really isn't going to affect your job on a daily basis, then you probably don't need to tell them. But what I do say is, if you don't reveal a disability, once you've accepted the position and you do have any problems and you haven't told anybody, and then you're let go, you don't have any recourse. So it's so important to know, what I need to tell somebody about this. I'll give you an example. I had an employer call me one day, and they had a receptionist at the front desk that they'd had for a while, but things weren't going very well in the past couple of months. She was talking really loud. She was being rude with the customers that were on the phone, and they didn't know what the problem was. Well, they thought maybe she was having a hearing problem. They weren't sure. And she didn't want to admit that she was having a hearing problem. Of course, maybe it had gone just, a little bit progression at a time. So maybe she didn't even realize how hard of a time she was having. But without the employee really coming forward to say, I'm having a really hard time, there wasn't really any recourse, because they couldn't help her. They couldn't offer accommodations. So they were going to have to let her go if something didn't change, if she didn't come forward, or if things didn't start to get better with that situation. Although we did talk about how to have that conversation, and they did, and she was able to be kept on, and they did get some different technology with the phone answering and some things like that, so it went better. Another situation I had was a gentleman that they went to an open floor plan here at our great big Black Hills Energy, and all of the offices are open floor plan with open area to collaborate. And this gentleman did not like it at all. He was not working at his best anymore. He was really uncomfortable, and they didn't know why. Well, once I went in and I talked to him a little bit, well, he had PSTD from the military, and having people come up from behind him was not something that was working well for him at all. So he went back into a regular office. So it was simple things like that can make a big difference, and that, revealing that disability really helps them, the employer, know why you're having trouble and what they can do to help you. So that takes us to the next thing. Assigned duties change. So maybe your position completely changes. I had that happen to me once, where I worked outside the office and I worked from home, and all of a sudden they want me in the office, and I needed to have equipment in there, and it was HIPAA laws, so I couldn't just bring my own computer in. So again, that was a real problem for me, to be able to change jobs to a completely different situation than what I was hired for. So, I told them this isn't going to work, which they already knew what my disability was, but I don't think they understood how that was going to affect me. My daughter she did manage a Starbucks. Now she's with Dutch Brothers, and they have a whole line of people in the bistro. And Mary has a really rare autoimmune disease that caused her to lose her eyesight. And she doesn't have, they had to remove her eye on the left side. So when she has a team of people on her left side, she can't see them at all. So it was a problem. So they needed to make sure everybody was working from her right side forward. What part of the jobs are you having difficulty with? To let people know if there's a part of the job. Again, like with Mary, that was a problem for her to have people on her left side because she couldn't see them. And letting, you know, her district manager or whoever know that was happening, so they better understood if she was having any difficulty, or so that the rest of the staff knew that. And then have recommendations and solutions available. So again, it's just having that conversation, kind of knowing what you need to do. We have some other amazing stories here. We have one gal, Pam, she manages, or she did manage, she's gonna have a baby, so she just stepped down, but she's legally blind and she manages at Wendy's. And again, that was just making sure that her staff knew that she was legally blind, making sure things were picked up and that there was communication like coming through. She was able to count money because she knew exactly where it went in the drawer. And she did an amazing job. She'd been there for, I think, 12 years. Another great example was a gentleman, Aaron. He was here and then he went out to California. He wanted to do body tech work in auto body. He is legally blind and deaf. He has Usher's disease. And when he was in California, they hired him, but they just sent him in a corner. He came back to South Dakota and one of the shops here had seen his work and they're like, we'll take him in a minute. They call him Magic Aaron. And all of the body work is done by feel and he does an amazing job, an absolutely amazing job. So if someone has a passion for a certain field that they want to be in and you're like, I don't know how that's going to work, I really encourage you to encourage them to figure out if that is a possibility and that they can do it. Because when we think about Aaron, we think about auto body work. How could he do that? But when you really realize how it's all done by feel. And he did an amazing job. And he is being able to live his dream by having that position. He's paid a great wage and he's raising a family. I guess I'll let Kevin take over now. He's got a number of things that he could tell you from his perspective of how he works with interviews and once he's hired somebody. So Kevin.
Sure. Yeah, so Katie did a really great comprehensive look at a lot of the laws and things around accommodations. And I hope you heard through those examples that every situation is so unique. I don't think I've run into two employees with exactly the same accommodations needed or exactly the same in his supply. It makes it fun because you have to be creative and adaptable, but that can be a challenge too. One of the questions Katie asked me to speak to was how to bring up a disability during an interview, because I think our culture is going through a shift, or it should be going through a shift, where we want to share disabilities, challenges more upfront, even as soon as the interview process. And I don't want to count because I might make myself depressed, but I've probably done over 1,000 interviews. And these are just a few tips from me. I think if we want to spend more time on this and make these lists longer, we definitely could. But here's just some kind of initial thoughts that struck me about how I've seen applicants bring up disabilities or physical challenges in a good way, and how maybe in not such a good way. So to start with the do's here, things to do, and talk a little bit about each one. So one thing is it is totally fine, even if an applicant feels they don't have a disability, it's good to ask questions about essential job functions. Of course, read that job description when you're applying for the position, see what it's doing, but ask what are the major day-to-day things I do, and see how that interacts with maybe a limitation or a restriction that you have. You might be surprised that, like Katie mentioned, standing, maybe it's a job that sits 90% of the day. You know, that standing 10% is not going to be an issue, and you can hear that or find that out from an interviewer, just asking about what does the day-to-day look like, what are the essential job functions, and an interviewer should know that offhand, and if not, you know, rephrasing that question as what does a typical day look like in this position. That's also a great way to find out for the students you help. Is this really, you know, is this job really a fit? Maybe something comes up there that wasn't posted in job ad or was glossed over, or maybe there's an exciting part that they get to speak to. You know, give the employer interviewer a chance to show off what the job is, and also just share the facts about what is this position. Another thing is to suggest accommodations, and I'm going to combine this with the next bullet point on this, is keep positive, eager attitude, friendly, smile. If I have an applicant who says, you know, I can't lift more than 10 pounds and just stops there and just waits, well, I need more than that. If it's a position that's going to require a lot of lifting, maybe you can suggest something. For instance, in like a warehouse position, you might have someone that says, well, I can't lift, you know, I can't carry these baskets around and fill parts orders. Instead, if I hear that, like, if I have wheels and a cart, you know, to push these orders around, I'll have no problem keeping up with these requirements. And just looking at it like that, like, well, I can do this, and I'll hit more of these at the last slide of the cans versus the can'ts, but just looking for ways that, you know, I can do this, you know, even though the essential job functions may require this, I can do it if I have this, and just suggesting those accommodations and keeping that positive, eager attitude, friendly, smile. And I know as you help a lot of adult students, you're telling that you know, during interviews, remain positive, you know, that eager willingness attitude, but don't drop that attitude when you're talking about a disability or restriction, to say, you know, this is fine, I'm adaptable, I can overcome this, and share suggestions for how to do that. Another thing is, you know, you might detect, or as you're interviewing, you might see an interviewer kind of pause, like, well, I'm not sure because this position requires driving, and based on these medications you need to take, or you've told me that, you know, because of some medications you can't drive. You know, don't be afraid to say, well, let me get my doctor and see if I can adjust my medications or change this, and get back to you right away with that. So if an interviewer is maybe uncomfortable, maybe it's the first time they've met with someone with a disability, they're not sure what to do, offer to get that more information. And maybe that means going back to a doctor or physical therapy assistant. Maybe that means going back to their adult education teacher and saying, hey, I came up with this at the business, trying to figure out how I can do this one essential function because I really want to work at this company or in this role. So opposite of do's, there are some don'ts. We can go back to that last slide. So one thing, and maybe these are, you know, just my experience, but I think other interviewers would overlap a little with these. One is, don't share your specific diagnosis or condition. As Katie went through the ADA requirements, a lot of those from an employer perspective are centered around what are the restrictions, what are the things we need to work around, not what is the specific diagnosis. For instance, you know, I can't lift more than 10 pounds because I have tendonitis. The part of that the employer needs is more than 10 pounds, and working around that, not necessarily need to know the diagnosis and condition. There's a lot of out of scope information that applicants often bring up in interview too. For example, and this is almost the opposite of the, you know, eager willingness attitude, where they'll bring up something like, you know, I have this condition because of this injury caused by this that happened 10 years ago because this drunk driver, etc. You're getting a little out of scope there. In interviewers, we like to listen, we like to hear things, but we're trying to connect it to the job, the position, fit for business. So when you bring in a lot of that out of scope information, that's maybe more appropriate shared with family, friends, Bible study, things like that, not the workplace interview. But don't be ashamed of needing accommodations or having a condition. That's something the business, like I said, we want to be creative, we want to adapt, we want to work around. So don't sit back and think, well, you know, I'm less of a person, or, you know, I'm not comfortable sharing that I need, you know, extra, you know, I need to stop and pause and take more bathroom breaks or anything like that. Just share the need and how you plan to make that, you know, as limited impact on the business. Like Katie talked about Katie talked about, you know, not reasonable accommodations, things like that. You know, how are you going to make this a reasonable accommodation, easy to do? And finally, you know, don't answer a question that focuses on your disability, focus on your ability, right? Like you mentioned the body tech, you know, I can't, you know, see the lines in the car, but I can feel them really well. And focusing on what you're able to do and not how you're restricted and how you'll overcome that. Next, Katie asked me to talk a little bit about criminal convictions. I don't feel that's the thrust of our conversation today, but, you know, maybe this is the exposure you'll get to help someone who does have a criminal record. So I'll kind of run through this kind of fast.
And just because, well, and there are a number of people with disabilities that end up in the criminal system, unfortunately. And I'm sure with adult education, they're trying to, you know, change their life and go forward. So I thought this was you know, it kind of overlaps. So this is good information that Kevin had.
Sure. Yeah, so we also work with those with criminal convictions. So when you're working with a student and maybe they share that they've had something on their history and they're not sure how to disclose it, keep in mind first, most, not all employer background checks, they're looking for results from the past 7 years. So if it's longer than that since anything's happened and you're not going to work for like the FBI or the TSA or you know, somewhere where they need security clearance, it might not show on a criminal background check. And I believe it's law. Someone can double check me on this, but that we only go back 7 years for a private employer to look at convictions. However, that little word in there, you know, look for any result. It really is any. So all kinds of misdemeanors show up that I talked to applicants later and like, I never expected that to show up. It can be something simple as a DUI, trespassing, where they were maybe pulled over and given a ticket and they feel like they paid it and it shouldn't be there anymore. Or, you know, maybe they're at a party that got a little crazy and, you know, they have a disorderly conduct and they're looking at me saying, well, I never went to court. How does this show? And I don't know all the ins and outs of the courts, but just being aware that stuff will show and to disclose it if asked. Which is why you want to disclose it. And I'll get to that in a sec. If you're ever like an applicant is denied, maybe they come back to you and say, they told me I didn't get this position because there was this disorderly conduct or something on my background check from years ago. What can I do? The first thing to do is get a copy of that background check. So per the Fair Credit Reporting Act, you have a right to that background check. Employers, including myself, we're happy to provide that, print that out for you, get it to electronically, however an applicant needs that, to look over. And if there are errors on there, maybe a judge said this would be removed. Maybe there's something where someone was impersonating another person, use another identity. We want to get that off. And all background check companies I worked with, they want to hear from people when their background checks are wrong, to get that taken off and dispute any errors. It also is helpful. Maybe it's not an error, but then you have a copy of that background check to look at for any future positions. Say this, you know exactly what a future employer is going to see. The state laws, or sorry, I'm not there yet. If you are asked about criminal history, denying or lying is not the best practice. If you say, no, I have nothing on my background check, and then something comes back, maybe there's a theft for petty theft for 2 years ago, well, that gives the employer the impression that you've lied to them, whether during the interview, on the application, so it's not something to necessarily hide. Many states do, they have ban the box laws, which prevent employers from asking about it at certain stages. For some, it's you can't ask about it until at the interview. Some it's offer, some it's until after offer, till after you've offered the position. So that varies a little bit. Some states, cities have rules about that. But when asked, again, within the confidence law, when asked, you do want to disclose those things. And you want to match the positions you're helping a student find with the convictions they have. So maybe there is like a petty theft or something. And I think there were some sub bullet points on this, Stephanie. They come up. If not, that's all right. All right. So for instance, if you're working with a student who has multiple DUIs, most businesses are going to be hesitant to give that person a keys to the company van to go off driving all by themselves. So maybe that might not be the best position fit. Honesty related convictions for a position that requires cash handling. Again, businesses might look at that and say, well, we want to wait till a little more time has passed since that theft conviction before we put you in charge of thousands of dollars in our safe room or cash room. And in violence related convictions, there's a lot of roles. This may describe where you're working now, where people are working alone with vulnerable adults. We want to make sure there's no history of any kind of violence, any kind of sex crimes, of course, for those positions. Just to give an example, so here at the Holiday Inn, we do have people staying in rooms. We have employees with cards, obviously. We check those and control those as much as we can, but they have access to guest rooms. That comes up on, we see background checks that sometimes prevent a hire because we can see where a guest might feel uncomfortable knowing that this person had access to their room. And of course, we also host events and things with vulnerable populations. And I go into that a little more detail, but it's time to keep going. And then Katie and I were talking yesterday about, criminal convictions and sharing those. And when you're upfront about them, sometimes, I'm next to another business at a job fair, and I know that they will hire someone with this on their criminal history or this criminal history, and asking and saying, hey, I know I don't have a position here. Do you have any idea of where I want to apply? Even though it's a different business, maybe different industry, we might have ideas like that. Human Resources does network, and oftentimes we're able to assist in that way. Like I have go-tos for, maybe even we have an employee who I just found out can't work anymore because of this. Sometimes very rarely a restriction, but maybe a criminal conviction, and we want you to succeed, even if that's not here. So.
And that's important for disabilities too, I think, just having the student go to that interview, even if they've got an interview, even though there's not an opening right at that minute, we don't know that there won't be one tomorrow or the next day. And we also don't know who Kevin knows that might be able to say, hey, I had a great interview with this candidate. I can't take them, but maybe you've got an opening. So.
Yeah, connecting those applicants to the right position, we all win. Talk a little bit about the interactive process from the employer perspective, and this is going to repeat a little bit of what Katie said, but more so from the employer side, like how I'm looking at it. So first thing, when someone says, hey, I can't perform at the same level as another employee unless I have an accommodation, for me, the first thing is that's where I start. There's a need here. There's a need for an accommodation. If someone says, hey, I need to start wearing a brace when I need to work, and then I'll be fine, I can work just like others. To me, that's not really an accommodation, because any employee can wear a knee brace at any time. I don't need to get into the restrictions and medical notes and things like that for that type of accommodation. You mentioned hearing difficulty. Any of our employees can wear hearing aids in any one of our positions. That wouldn't be a special accommodation. When there is a need, when there is some way we need to accommodate this, we engage in an interactive process. And the word interactive there truly means interactive. I can't, like one of the examples I shared with Katie is you can't just come into the HR office, slap down a list of here's all my restrictions, figure it out. That's not how the interactive process works at all. It's three parties, maybe more, working together to figure it out. So one, I have to look at, is there physical, mental impairment substantially limiting a major life activity? Might need a medical note to prove that, but sometimes disabilities, like we talked about invisible disabilities, there are some that are more obvious. So I can tell if someone is unable to reach a certain item because of height or another restriction, and might not need that medical note. I'll look at the essential functions of the position, like what is the absolute need. For example, we talked about shuttle drivers. So you're going to the airport, you're picking up guest bags, loading those up and taking those back to the hotel. Obviously, there's a driving requirement there. That's pretty essential. There's a lifting guest bag. That's pretty essential. But guest bags are not going to weigh over 200 pounds typically. So there's probably an upper limit on how much weight comes with that position and a few other things. So it goes to that position and look at that. And maybe that essential function, maybe they can't lift for a brief period, will they recover, help with that. Maybe we've got two people going to the airport, one can lift, one can drive. And then working around those essential functions. Third there, so I like the discussion. So discussion with the employee, health providers, supervisors, other supporters, including vocational rehab counselors. I wanted to include here that we could also talk to the adult education teachers if you have ideas, because again, I mentioned that creative and adaptive. Oftentimes employees will, I like the example of the pallet. The employee will bring up a way to accommodate that the employer might not have thought of, or the doctor. And this is kind of a plug based on my experience, but physical therapy assistants are also great help because they know the mechanics of the body for a lot of these physical restrictions, and they can help you decide, like, maybe you can't lift it this way, but what if you were able to lift it this way? Or what if it was lifted to this height? Then I can see where we wouldn't be, hurting a previous condition. When the need for accommodation is not obvious, I do ask for a medical information, and the ADA provides a form. At Holiday Inn, we use that form. Some companies have created their own, but it's pretty straightforward. Just gets everything in black and white as to what restrictions, what kind of goal lines or border lines we need to stay within. If the undue hardship, Katie mentioned this, and undue hardships vary. For a huge company, the undue hardship level might be easier to accommodate something than for a small company like ours with fewer employees. With 3 employees, there may not be someone else to cover a restriction or help out lifting a certain item. But when there's hundreds, it gets a little easier. For instance, something like Amazon warehouses, they have lots of other employees that can help with different restrictions. Undue hardship, that's a terribly hard thing to measure. But typically, if you're able to perform to the same standard as before with an accommodation that doesn't cost more than what the business can bear, again, it's a very nebulous definition, but the undue hardship is typically looks at the size of the business, what the accommodation is, how much they'd have to do, and how it affects other employees. For instance, if you're working in a greenhouse and said, I can't be around the heat and humidity because of this condition, so I'm going to take the office job instead. Well, kicking an office employee out of their office job to put you there, that would be an undue hardship. And then unfortunately, sometimes those things happen. But again, like we mentioned in the previous slide, sometimes there's networking, there's other businesses where I know, hey, this is a great employee. We can't accommodate this, but would you be interested in, of course, working with the employee on that as well? Obtain medical information, and then a direct threat. This is pretty rare, but this is an exception where the employee's restrictions could cause harm to themselves or others. I'm just going to go for the easy example of narcolepsy in a crane operator. Obviously, if they're going to fall asleep at any moment and they're operating hundreds of tons of moving equipment with other employees, maybe on a construction site, that is not going to be a good fit. And once in a while, there's mental impairments that come up with that as well. Maybe a tendency for violence in a position where there's a lot of vulnerability or things that could happen where that would be a direct threat. But fortunately, those are pretty rare. They do come up. So we can go to the next slide. We talk about. So wrapping up, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here with focus on the can, not the can't. And of course, this is kind of an attitude, willingness, overall life focus, if you will. But here's some ways to phrase that coming from someone who's seeking an accommodation. To say, I can lift this amount if it's rendering a little different on my screen. I can lift this amount with a dolly or cart. I can package those parts when the pallet of items is lifted up to waist height. Maybe I can't bend over to reach things off the ground. I can operate this machine if when the buttons are clearly marked. I can type 30 plus words a minute when using a speech to text program, or I can verbally communicate with coworkers using this app on my device or another technology function that maybe the employer is not even aware of. And focusing on those, I can do this part of the job when I have this. Instead of I can't do that, there's just no way, and walking away, using that adaptability, creativity to come at every accommodation need, and everyone is different. So a lot of the things I've talked about, it's available on SHRM.org. That's a community resources professional organization that goes through and provides a lot of advice, worksheets for how to work with accommodations, disabilities. Anyone has access to that, you can definitely access that. I don't want anyone thinking, I'm coming up with these great original thoughts. A lot of them are from SHRM. This is obvious, I'm not an attorney, so legal advice, but I hope these tips are helpful as you're helping students, because we really do want to see more people in the right places and find good fits for their positions.
And then I think I have Jan up there. The Job Accommodation Network is another great one that they can go to. And that one can help the applicant or the employer, so to find different accommodations. Is there questions?
I was personally thinking you might want to speak to maybe tailoring some mock interviews or master applications. Like, would that be helpful from a HR perspective, so that they're really prepared to answer those kinds of questions? For you, Kevin?
Oh, absolutely. So asking, doing those mock interviews, and asking a question about how, this employer, and maybe just take a position they're looking at or most interested in, this employer might ask, how do you plan to accomplish this task that maybe appears to be outside of your restrictions? And, them being ready with an answer, like, I can do this when this, I only need this, and I can keep up with the business's requirements. Is that what you're thinking?
Yep, that was, so we also had a question in the chat box about discussing accommodations for students who've been incarcerated that might have learning disabilities. And that was kind of my thought, is maybe the mock interviews and the master applications could assist with that, because then they would have some experience and something to work off of. But can you think of anything else that might be assistive there in terms of you looking at it from an employer standpoint?
Sure. So especially with the mental restrictions, there might be a little, stop me from getting a little off base here, but like some employees need very clear lists of what to do. Like, when I come into work, I do this and this and this, and asking an employer to put together that list, that guide, those instructions, if you will, to keep them on task and focused. That's typically a reasonable accommodation that we can do.
Perfect. And there were a couple of sites that you guys mentioned. Would you be able to drop those into the chat box, and so that people can click on the links and see those things? Or could you provide those to me and I'll make sure that they get out to the people?
Sure. So yeah, mine is just sherm.org. And it is, some of their content is behind a paywall, but a lot of it is open to anyone who looks up as well. It's just shrm.org, and it was it's in PowerPoint as well. Might be hiding somewhere in there. I don't see it right now.
Yeah, so that's the Society of Human Resource Management, and then the other one was JAM, the Job Accommodation Network, and that one's completely open. I was just going to say about disabilities. Recently, LinkedIn has included dyslexia as a skill because they're big thinkers. Big thinkers, small typos. I'm in that category too, I think. So,
all right. And okay, so let's see. We have, maybe make a list of the things that I can do would help people remember the can do things at the time of the interview. So I think that's kind of a big take home for people. And then the only other thing I really was wondering is, I was kind of considering occupational therapy as maybe being a great place to kind of look for some of those answers as well. What can we do, or how can we look for those accommodations? Can you speak to that at all?
Sure. So yeah, occupational therapists, I'm glad you brought that up. So they can be part of a process to figure out, well, how can we accommodate, but also they may have worked with others who have similar restrictions, and they know what types of jobs typically fit within those restrictions. Occupational therapists, we've had them visit the hotel here looking at, how does a room attendant clean a room? What are they doing? What actions are they going through? So they know right off, like they can recognize, well, what are the restrictions for this job? What are the essential job functions, and how can I help this applicant meet those, or train them to a place where they're ready to meet those?
and then Stephanie, I would also say vocational rehabilitation, because every state has a vocational rehabilitation office. So even if the student isn't with vocational rehabilitation, they might want to become a client of rehabilitation, because all their services are free and they're really good at providing that accommodation, because the whole purpose of vocational rehabilitation is to get the person gainfully employed.
Perfect. If anybody else has any other questions, burning questions they want to put in the chat box or the Q&A, I think I would ask you to do that now so we can address those. And we'll give it a little bit of wait time here. All right, I'm not seeing anything else pop up, but we do have a webinar poll. So make sure you answer the webinar poll, and I appreciate your guys' time. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for speaking with us about this important role of accommodations in the workplace and how we can help students think about these things early on. And I guess my thought would be we need to put it into our enrollment process, our orientation process, and then speak about it often so that they're really prepared. And then help them maybe with interviewing skills and making sure that they're really navigating that world of work and having kind of prepared answers and being really prepared to have those conversations with HR. I'm going to check one more time in the chat box. Yeah, they say they've learned so much. So thank you for everything. We appreciate your time.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for having
Thanks
us.
for all you do.
Thank you, Kevin and Catherine and Stephanie. That was an awesome presentation. I want to thank everybody for joining us today as well. I hope everybody has a great rest of their day and a great rest of their week. Thank you very much. See you later, everybody.
Thank you so much, guys. Oh, I missed it.